There we go. So welcome to our presentation on making space for the birds and bees. This is a presentation of the Victoria Seed Library, and the Victoria Seed Library is a growing partnership between Life Cycles and the Greater Victoria Public Library. So we've been sharing seed through the Greater Victoria Public Library for the last 7 years. It's a totally free initiative. Anybody can get involved and join the Victoria Seed Library. We make a really interesting collection of locally grown seeds available to all of our members. And to become a member and sign seed out from our official collection, you just need to attend a member orientation workshop. Perhaps some of you are already members of the Seed Library. If you're not, we have our last member orientation of the year in 2 weeks' time. It's in two Thursdays from now, not next Thursday, but the Thursday after, at this same time, 7 o'clock. And you can register for that event through Lifecycle's website. You can find us on Facebook or on Eventbrite. Um, and the Victoria Seed Library is a lovely initiative sharing seed and keeping seed in the people's hands. If you have seed and you want to give us seed, you can return seed to the central branch at any time. I'm not going to talk too much about the seed library today because we're all here to learn more about making space for the birds and bees. Everybody knows the Greater Victoria Public Library and the lovely things that they do, but you may not be as familiar with Life Cycles. Life Cycles is a nonprofit organization that's been operating in the Capital Regional District here on southern Vancouver Island for 27 or 28 years now. Life Cycles does a lot of really interesting work supporting people connecting with food, and they've run the Fruit Tree Project for many years. You may have heard of that, where people harvest fruit from folks' backyards who have an abundance of fruit and redistribute the fruit to those in need. They also do a lot of school garden programs and a number of other really interesting food and garden related programming. If you're interested in learning more, I would really recommend checking out their website. You can Google search Life Cycles, or it's lifecycles.ca. So I just heard somebody who's, if you are not muted, if you could make sure that your microphone is muted so that we have a smooth presentation here. So before I get started with the presentation, I want to start by acknowledging that I'm currently on the traditional unceded territories of the Songhees and Esquimalt people. It's, I think, really important to acknowledge these traditional territories and the unceded nature of them, especially given the context of what we're talking about today. A lot of people like me, families who came to this place, brought a lot of violence to the birds and bees and people who have lived here since time immemorial. And I'm trying to learn and become better at bringing health and peace to this place. I think I think it's important to acknowledge that I am a settler and that I'm very much at the beginning of my learning curve on learning how to make space for the birds and bees, and that my ancestors who arrived here 3 generations ago, and the people who came with them, they brought a lot of harm and did a lot of damage, both to the people who lived here as well as to the birds and bees that lived here. And it's an important history to acknowledge and to recognize and to think about. And I'm excited to have so many people here to talk about how we can make space for birds and bees again in this place. And because this is an electronic online presentation, I think it's also important to say that I'm on southern Vancouver Island in British Columbia, Canada, and all of the knowledge I'm sharing is from this place. If you're from another part of the world, it may be that a lot of what I speak about today is not that applicable to you. I learned in our last presentation, we had a lot of people from all over the world who were there, and it was important for me to make that statement at the beginning. I'm sorry that you're going to have to hear my clicking a little bit as we go. I don't have headphones that work for my computer, so I have to click, and I know it's a bit of a loud noise. To start, I just want to tell you a little bit more about myself. My name is Matthew Kemshaw. I'm the founder of the Victoria Seed Library, and I work in the Souk School District for the Edward Milne Community School Society, actually, as a garden coordinator working in the 4 high schools out there. I've been working and learning and supporting garden education in a variety of different contexts for the last about 18 years now. I've always been really interested in growing food as a way of connecting people with the land and with the source of their sustenance. I grew up in Shawnigan Lake. I'm 1/8 Irish and the rest English ancestor on these places. And as I said before, my family arrived here in the early 1910s, 1911 on my mom's side and 1918 on my dad's side. And we've been living here on southern Vancouver Island really ever since. Um, I have been really interested in birds and bees and bugs and all of the animals that live in gardens since I started gardening and trying to learn a lot about them. I've learned a lot from just being out in the garden. I've also had a lot of mentors and teachers, a lot of people I've worked with in garden settings and community gardens and met through different kinds of organizational work. And so a lot of what I'm sharing today is, a testament to the knowledge I've gained from all of these amazing people.
Just can't get it to go.
Sorry, I'm hearing somebody again. So if you could please make sure that you make sure you're muted. Thank you very much. So that's about me. It's probably as much as you need to know about me for now. The agenda for today, we're going to talk about garden elements that support wildlife, kind of broad picture, kind of the basic beginner, what you need to know, some of the easy things to start attracting wildlife in your garden. And then we'll talk a little bit more in detail about some of the plants that support different types of bees, butterflies, and birds in particular. And then we're going to talk about who might be living in your garden. So talk a little bit more about some of the different kinds of bees and birds that we have living around us on southern Vancouver Island. And then finally, we'll talk a bit about nesting structures and how to build nesting structures for solitary nesting bees and birds. And between each of these sort of 4 sections, I'm going to pause and turn my screen off and check the chat and see if you have any questions. So if there are questions, I'm going to start by fielding them. And maybe I'll just kind of demonstrate now how that works and see if anybody has any questions before we get started. So I'll stop sharing so I can see clearly the chat. Somebody asked if I knew I was muted, and I just panicked, but I'm not muted now, right? You can hear me. Great. Thank you. So we do have somebody here from Sydney, Australia. That's amazing. Fabulous. Okay, no big questions. So I'm going to go back to sharing my screen and we'll get into after all of that preamble, the presentation such as it is. So there are 3 primary elements that I want to talk about that really can support wildlife. When you're thinking about how to make a garden that can be more supportive of birds and bees and other animals, it's important to be able to provide water, food, and shelter for these animals. These are kind of the key things we all need to survive. So when we're providing water, there's lots of different ways in which you can do it. Like a specially made bird bath can be really helpful, or a simpler bowl on the ground is also completely fine. You can attract different creatures to different settings, sort of depending on where you place your water. Some bowls on the ground may be better for some beetles and insects that crawl on the ground and have a harder time climbing up onto an elevated bird bath. Elevated bird baths can be nice for birds and provide a little bit of protection sometimes from some predators. It's nice, especially for birds, to place water near a shrub or tree because birds like to be able to have a place of safety that they can retreat to. So being able to provide them with a bit of shelter near to the water can be quite helpful. And when we're providing water, I think a mistake that's commonly made is that we put a dish of water out, but there's no way if a bee lands in there and falls in the water for that bee or other flying insect to get out of the water. So you can very easily just drop a couple of little wooden sticks into the water so they float and provide opportunities for small insects to climb up. Or you can have a dish or a bird bath that has a very sort of shallow graded slope so that there's opportunity for insects to get out and be rescued from the water. You definitely don't want to be drowning the creatures you're trying to help. Predators, particularly in the urban context, cats can be a big issue. And so it's really important if you are making effort to attract birds to your garden, that you think about doing it in such a way that's not going to just end up having them be preyed upon by cats. And so I've found that with the bird feeding that I've done through the winter, having my bird feeder up 6 feet in the air keeps the birds really safe from cats. Um, and if you have a lot of cats in your neighborhood, it may be important just to watch and see if you are trying different things to see if there are cats prowling around where you've provided water or food, and ensure that you're not just creating a trap. Um, it's also good to clean water if you're putting water out for birds or bees, and have it in a place that's easily accessible for you to be able to clean the water, not letting the water become too stagnant and full of rotten leaves and things. But fresh, clean water is best for our animals. And then, of course, a pond is a lovely wildlife feature and does such amazing things to provide habitat for a variety of different animals, from frogs and toads to dragonflies and even herons. Um, Shallow edges on a pond are quite important for wildlife, and also for having a lot of different interesting plants. If you're interested in growing aquatic plants, having sloping edges and the kind of slower that water rises, the more little zones there are for a lot of diversity of different plants. And as we'll talk about more, the more diversity of plant life you have in your garden, really the more diversity of animal life you're likely to attract. So that's a little bit about water. Providing food is obviously important for our animal friends. For pollinators, things like birds, sorry, birds. Well, there are a few birds that are pollinators, like hummingbirds, bees, and butterflies. Having a diversity of flowers in your garden that are blooming all through the year is really important. We don't want to have all of our plants flowering, say right now in April, May, and June, and then the rest of the year there's no flowers in our garden. The best thing is to have a real wide diversity of blooming times so that we have food available all through the year. And here in Victoria, on southern Vancouver Island, it's actually possible to have flowers almost all the time. Certainly from February to November, we can have flowers, pollen, and nectar available for all of those pollinators. And also having a diversity of colors can be really helpful. Um, for insects, little nooks and crannies are really important. And insects are a really important source of food for many birds. So providing a bit of mess in the garden can actually be a really good thing. Having some rotten logs, different places in which insects can really thrive and um, grow, is a really great thing for a lot of birds. Um, a lot of the birds who eat insects, they shift their diet in the wintertime when insects kind of go dormant and we don't see them around as much. And they start eating a lot more seeds and berries. So in this time, it's nice to be able to have plants that are producing berries and seeds, that will hang on plants through the winter. And so there's a picture here of a robin, I think, on a black hawthorn tree. And hawthorns are a great example of a small tree that produces a lot of berries that are really rich in seeds and also other nutrients that feed a lot of birds through the winter. Having plants like this that can hold on to those berries and seeds can be a really important source of food through the winter time when food is the most scarce. Also, a common garden sort of practice is to deadhead all of your flowers once they've finished making flowers. But after flowers usually come seeds, and some seeds are really important sources of nutrients for birds. And so leaving seed heads in the garden, especially larger seeds that are good food for birds, can be a really important practice as a gardener, to be providing more food for our birds. The other thing that I've started learning about myself is feeding birds with bird seed and a bird feeder. I live right by the Jubilee Hospital in Victoria, and I have a bird feeder right outside my kitchen window. And it brings me great joy to be able to watch the birds coming to the feeder and feeding through the winter time. It's recommended that you do feed the birds just through the winter. Um, but if you are feeding birds, one thing that is really important is that you try to keep your feeder and the area around it, especially the area directly underneath of it, really clean. Bird feeders are actually a real source of disease for birds. I think with the pandemic now we can really understand this more than maybe we did before. But with all of those birds congregating at the feeder, one sick bird can lead to a lot of sick birds really quickly. And so it is really important that you clean your feeder well. Um, and they recommend using a diluted bleach solution to clean your bird feeder at least once a month. And make sure that you're also switching out the seed in there and also raking and cleaning the area underneath of the feeder, even putting down a tarp or some sort of a material that you can remove all of the material from under the feeder is kind of best practice recommended. So that is something to consider. Here on southern Vancouver Island, we've had an outbreak of a virus that's affecting a bird species. It's especially bad out in Machosen right now. And the name of the species now is escaping me. I had made a note in my presentations because I knew this would happen. It's the pine siskin. The pine siskins are being badly affected by a virus that's being passed in feeders. So for the last couple of months, they've been recommending that we don't feed birds here on southern Vancouver Island. So water is important, food is important, and then shelter is important. We all need a house or a place to live. And animals also need places to rest away from fear of predation. And so for birds, you see a lot in the city, especially if you're walking around, you commonly see birds in places where they're kind of protected in big shrubs or trees. And so providing some of this space in your garden is a really great way to improve the habitat of your garden. Larger thickets and hedgerows can provide important places for animals to rest and to nest. And the other thing that, I think a lot of our sort of Victoria garden aesthetic forgets is that many animals require so-called unsightly materials like mud and twigs or dried grass for building their nests. Insects are like this. We'll talk more about different insects and the kinds of mud and materials they use. And birds as well require these things for nest building. So having some of this stuff around in our garden is important for all of these animals. And it doesn't mean that you have to have a completely messy, disastrous garden. You can have clean lines and nice pathways and, planned sizes of shrubs in some areas, but leave some areas to be a little bit more wild and unkept. And um, yeah, the other thing about shelter is recognizing that needs may change throughout the season and for different species. So providing a diversity of different places for both large and small animals to rest is important. And at this time of the year, especially last week when we had such cold temperatures, I was noticing a lot of insects that were sunning themselves on rocks and resting in the sun, just trying to warm up a little bit. So providing some of that space can be important, as well as providing that dense, dark thicket space for the birds. Having a diversity of different kinds of sort of resting places in the garden can be quite important. So that's the first section, sort of beginner broad strokes, ways to support wildlife in your garden. I'm just going to stop sharing my screen now and see if anybody has any questions or comments that they want to ask in our chat. And if you're new to Zoom and you don't know what I'm talking about with this chat, it's just at the bottom of your screen. There's a little menu item that says chat. So thank you. That was salmonella that was affecting the pine siskins. A good question here. Is there a way to prevent mosquito larvae from developing in a water source for birds, insects? So I think the common thing that's done for mosquito larvae is to put predators in the water source. Fish are a good predator of mosquito larvae and like to eat them in the water if you have a large enough and suitable enough kind of water habitat for fish. The other thing that's done if you have standing water, which doesn't really help the birds and bees, is covering it. Is done with like water catchment systems. But the other thing that you can do if you're providing water out in your garden just to feed wildlife is you can switch the water regularly. So dump the water and refill it. Have it just not a lot of water, but enough to feed birds and bees. And just make sure that you're regularly cycling it through the times in which insects like mosquitoes are laying their eggs and raising their young. An interesting comment from upstate New York that you have to stop using bird feeders in the spring because of bears. And there's certainly places around here on southern Vancouver Island where that may be the case too. Thank you for sharing that. It's lovely to have somebody from upstate New York here. Um, so that looks like all the questions. So I'll just jump right back into our presentation. Sorry for all the clicking again. I know it's kind of annoying. The next section is going to be talking about choosing plants for wildlife, and we're going to talk specifically about butterflies and some of the plants and considerations that they need, bees, birds, and then we'll talk very briefly about moths, beetles, flies, wasps, and all of the other interesting creatures that live in our gardens. So butterflies are an amazing insect that has a huge amount of diversity here on southern Vancouver Island. All of the information on this slide is from Saanich Native Plants, who have great resources on their website and are the go-to source for Indigenous plants here on southern Vancouver Island. As a nursery, they provide really great stock. There are 70 species of butterfly here on Vancouver Island, and the great majority of these are butterflies that live here year round. I think a lot of people think of butterflies, they think of the monarch butterfly, which is this very emblematic, amazing species that does this huge migration every year. And not all butterflies do that. A lot of the butterflies that live here do not migrate. They spend their whole life on Vancouver Island. So their entire life cycle from eggs, larvae, pupae to adults is spent here. And it's important to know that butterflies spend a good part of their life as caterpillars, and they need the host plants that the caterpillars eat most important for butterflies. The adults usually lay their eggs on these host plants, and the baby caterpillars spend most of their life on these host plants. And they can be very specific about which host plants they pick, and I'll show a slide next that talks a bit more about that. Um, it's interesting that a lot of adult butterflies nectar on a variety of species, so there isn't in the same way that there are needs for a host plant. They'll visit a lot more diversity of flowers. Indigenous flowers tend to be more attractive than non-indigenous flowers to a lot of species, but they do visit a lot and are just looking for nectar. But some butterflies rarely visit flowers, and they prefer mud, dung, sap, and rotten fruit. So a good butterfly garden is one that can sort of host all the life cycle phases. So it includes both the host plant or host plants for the butterfly, as well as lots of nectar plants that are available when the butterfly is in its adult life cycle. They also prefer sun, so having sunny spaces for the butterfly can be important. And so the best butterfly garden, just like I was saying before with pollinators, has a diversity of different flowers blooming at different times of the year. So in terms of host plants, it can get a little bit almost overwhelming with trying to think of matching butterfly to host plant. And to be honest, butterflies is not an area of expertise for me by any stretch. I'm just very much on my beginning of my learning curve with this. So I did this research to be able to provide the information. But you can see each dash has a different species of butterfly that lives commonly on Vancouver Island. And they have fairly specific host plants. They're not always just one plant. So the Anise swallowtail likes plants in the carrot family like spring gold and especially bare stem desert parsley. The painted lady butterfly likes woolly sunflower, lupins, pearly everlasting, and native thistles. So having a diversity of different indigenous plants kind of increases the likelihood that you have a lot of different host plants for butterflies in your garden. And if you are a bit of a butterfly nerd and you want to really say, like, there's a butterfly I really want to attract, and so you can go and find this information. Saanich Native Plants has the information here. I'll also share all my slides and notes after this presentation with everybody who attended. So if you're madly writing down notes, I should have said that before, I will share everything with you. But one thing to know is that there's actually 10 different local butterflies that preferentially lay their eggs on either ocean spray or stinging nettle. So if you're kind of just thinking, I'd like to provide habitat for butterflies, these are the two plants that are probably the best to get started with. Stinging nettle is a really lovely plant. It has a bad rap because it hurts if you touch the underside of the leaves, but it's actually really good food and quite delicious if you cook it. It destroys all of the sting. The stems of the plants were really important as for making a cordage, and it's a beautiful plant too, and it provides obviously a great home for butterflies. And then ocean spray is a larger shrub. Stinging nettle is a perennial that grows from rhizomes every year. So through the winter, it's not in your garden at all. And at this time of year, the nettles are about that big. They're the ones that I've seen around, and they get quite large by the midsummer. Ocean spray is a larger shrub, as you can see in the bottom, has these beautiful sprays of white blossoms. Two great plants for butterflies. So the next sort of plant selection I want to talk about is selecting plants for bees. So bees are an amazingly diverse group of insects. There are more than 450 species of bees in British Columbia. I couldn't find information on how many species of bees there are on Vancouver Island, but 450 in BC is a lot. uh, and and different bees have evolved and adapted with different plants and their flowers. And so planting a diversity of flowering plants is kind of key to ensuring there's lots of flowers in bloom through the year, and the different types of flowers that are good for different types of bees. Um, I think it's important to note that it's a lot of the indigenous plants that have grown in our region have co-evolved with bees. And so I think when I do Google searches for pollinator gardens, I see a lot of pollinator gardens that have a lot of kind of cultivated plants. These are plants that have been domesticated by people, and they're probably good pollen sources for a few of our indigenous bees, but they may not be great for a lot of the different types of bees that are in our gardens. They're probably really good for honeybees. And so, in the bottom of the picture is a picture of a honeybee, and the top is a picture of a blue orchard mason bee. I think we think of honeybees as being this really great sort of pollinator, but honeybees are a domesticated insect, and the 450 species of bees in British Columbia are also really important bees, and I think we need to try to support those bees as well. And in doing that, the best way to do it is to focus on planting indigenous species. While non-indigenous flowers do provide sources of pollen and nectar for bees, indigenous plants are likely some of the best sources of pollen and nectar for our indigenous bees. So here, again, from Saanich Native Plants, my go-to resource for information about all of the different indigenous plants that live on southern Vancouver Island, they've created this amazing list of indigenous plants that are really great attractors of a big diversity of local indigenous bees. And so if you're not from southern Vancouver Island, it may be worth getting to know local nurseries who are sort of specialized in growing plants of your region. And they probably have some good information, or I would hope they would have some information about which plants would be good for attracting bees in your area. And I do want to say again that any flower can be a good source of pollen and nectar, but these ones are great. And so some of these plants are harder to grow than others. Things like nodding onion, common snowberry, pearly everlasting, sea blush is an annual that can be kind of easy. Um, Douglas aster, spring gold, fireweed can become a real weed in your garden, tall Oregon grape, um, woolly sunflower, yarrow. The plants I've just named are ones that I see a lot in the urban context that are pretty easy to grow. Some of these other, well, some of them can be a little bit trickier, and indigenous plants often have a reputation for being plants that, because they're from around here, they're adapted to growing here, and therefore they're super easy to grow. But it's not always the case. Some of these plants don't take to cultivation super well, and so they need quite a bit of coddling and care. And the fact of the matter is, a lot of the environments we live in are super altered and no longer great spaces for indigenous plants, and so work is required to get them happy again. Um, but a lot of these plants, once established, will thrive and provide great food for bees for many years. So that's a nice list of some of the good plants in our region for indigenous bees. We'll talk more about the different kinds of bees that there are And for more comprehensive information and lists of plants, their bloom times, and the pollinators they attract, I really recommend this guide, Selecting Plants for Pollinators. It's been published by Pollinator Partnership Canada, and it's available at this link here. I'm just going to click on it and see if it will take us to it. So you can see here that there's all of these guides for different regions of Canada. And in British Columbia, where I am, there's this one for Eastern Vancouver Island. There's some others there you can see for the Lower Mainland, Western Vancouver Island. Some of you may be there. I don't think we have any for our friend in New York. There may be, though. There's a pollinator partnership in the United States that started there. And this guide is super informative. It has detailed information about the different kinds of pollinators that live around us and the different colors and um, sort of characteristics of flowers. And it has, I'm just trying to get to the chart I know is in here. I'm sorry, this may be a bit difficult to watch. So here we have this great list of trees and shrubs and
Sorry, I'm just going to interrupt real quick. When you are clicking on a link and going to another screen, it doesn't share for us.
Thank you for interrupting.
Your screenshot still.
I see. I wondered about that.
Sorry to interrupt.
No, I appreciate you interrupting me. So you just got to watch me sort of, or the screen. I got it up here. Let's see if I can share it now. So this is the Pollinator Partnership guide, and they have these great long lists of plants. And what I find helpful for garden planning, it tells you a bit about like the flower season and what time of year they're flowering, what conditions these plants need, what sorts of sunlight, soil conditions, what types of pollinators they attract. So for planning your garden, these kinds of more detailed guides can be quite helpful for getting specific and knowing, oh well, that corner of my yard is partially shady and the soil is quite dry. So that can kind of help focus your search for plants. Forbs are smaller plants that sort of grow smaller than shrubs. So long lists of interesting indigenous plants, vines, shelter plants, and then they also have some of our more kind of cultivated plants here, and shows some of the different types of bees and pollinators that are attracted to these plants. And this I found to be quite telling. For, we have I have catnip in my front yard, and I think it's such a great pollinator attractor. And yeah, it does attract these 3 different sorts of species of pollinator, but there are a number of others that it doesn't attract. And I think, our indigenous plants attract a wider diversity, I suspect, of pollinators. But some of our cultivated plants, and Phacelia is known as being a great pollinator plant. And you can see the Phacelia line here has a lot of X's with attracting a lot of different types of pollinators. So that's a resource that that you may find useful as you're thinking about what kinds of plants you'd like to plant in your garden to attract wildlife, and particularly pollinators. So I'm just going to go back and we'll talk just a little bit about birds and what sorts of plants attract birds. There are, on southern Vancouver Island, less resources for identifying plant species that support local birds, and there are many migratory and resident bird species who live here. But many of our birds that we try to attract to our urban gardens or to our gardens are birds that are feeding on berries and seeds. Nectar, of course, is an important food source for some, and insects as well are really important sources of food, which I've already sort of mentioned. So when you're thinking about what to plant in your garden, hedgerows that incorporate indigenous plants and can provide both shelter and food for birds can be really great for attracting and building habitat for birds. Berry producing shrubs that grow quite well are things like Nootka rose, red flowering currant, Oregon grape, and red elderberry. The previous slides about attracting pollinators, will support a lot of insect diversity. And that insect diversity attracts a lot of bird diversity because birds actually eat pollinators. And so if you're bringing pollinators into your garden, you're probably also bringing birds into your garden. Another thing that I think is important to recognize is that large trees are great habitat for a lot of different types of birds. And so planting bigger trees if you have the space, or not cutting down bigger trees if it's something you're considering, might be a good way of ensuring that you have good habitat for birds on your property. And as I've mentioned before, seeds are an important source of food. And so allowing seeds to stand in your garden can be a really useful way of providing some food um, for the birds. So that's all I wanted to say about some of the plants that you can plant in your garden to attract birds, bees, and other wildlife. Um, this next section is about who might be in your garden. I'm just going to pause and see if anybody has any questions or comments.
Hey, I just want to ask this one.
Sure.
So, is it hard to get like some type of the soil and make like our own small garden with those bees and stuff?
Yeah, so in terms of preparing an area, often with indigenous plants, the local soil, if you're not working with super disturbed site, can be good enough for planting into. Amending the soil a bit with some compost and organic fertilizer is always a good idea. If you're interested in more detailed information on how to prepare a site for planting, I did do a workshop a month ago on growing and saving seed from indigenous plants. And I talked a lot in that workshop about how to prepare a site, and especially if you're thinking about like turning from grass to a garden, which is
Mhm.
usually what happens if you're trying to build a garden. There's quite a bit of information in there about how to do that. I'll share a link to my website, which on the website there's a copy of that presentation you could check out. There's a
Oh,
lot
great,
there's a lot
great,
to
yeah.
say in that question, and I'm not sure I have time to answer your question adequately, but it is a good question, and there are some good resources I can point you towards, which I've done a little bit already, I guess.
Yeah, thank you so much because I'm really interested in, this topic
Mm-hmm.
and I really want to make a garden of my own, but I don't have like enough knowledge for this.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, it's really helpful.
Yeah,
Thank you.
no problem. Another question here: is there a good place to get a bit of a curated list of things to plant in Victoria? I've seen long lists, but I'm interested in help to plan and keep things simple for choosing. Yeah, it's a really good question, and I've thought about that too. There is certainly a lot of diversity. I've tried to highlight a couple of plants in this presentation these ones are good in sort of easy starter plants. Um, but another thing to do, I would say, especially if you're like me and you agree that indigenous plants might be the way to go, would be actually to go out to Saanich Native Plants or to your local indigenous plant nursery and to talk to them directly. And they'll be able to give you a lot of advice and help steer you in the right direction around what would be the things that would be best suited for your kind of sort of gardening skill level, your site, and all of that. Um, it's a tricky thing to create a curated list because there's so many contexts that would affect what the list should say, if that makes sense. But a good question. Somebody picked a big bowl of nettles yesterday. That's awesome. Somebody found the link here. Thank you, Lindsay. Um, awesome. And again, I will share these slides with everybody who registered for this workshop afterwards. So if there's links that I'm showing in the slides, I will provide those. So I'm going to jump back into it, start sharing my screen again. So this next section, we're going to talk about who might be living in your garden. I'm sorry that you can't see that text here. Let me move me out of the way. There we go. And I'm going to talk a little bit about bees, birds, butterflies, bats, snakes, and wasps. and give you a little bit more information about some of the different types of species, or at least groups of species, that you're likely to see in your backyard garden. So with bees, like I said before, there are over 450 species in BC. And we know, I think, a lot about the honeybee. The honeybee is a very popular insect that a lot of people know a lot about, but a lot of these other bees are lesser known. And a lot of them, in fact, most of them are solitary nesting bees who make their homes in the ground or in small holes. So they're solitary insects. They're not social insects like honeybees are. There are some indigenous or native bees that are social insects, like a lot of bumblebees live in nests underground, and they have a queen and a sort of stratified social society where there are sort of worker bees and drones and different sort of roles within the society. But a lot of the bees that live here are these solitary bees who make their homes, like I say, in ground or in small holes in wood. Um, it's important, I think, to reiterate that honeybees are a non-native domesticated insect, and there's increasing sort of studies that are showing that the care of honeybees is actually somewhat detrimental to the health and well-being of all of the native bees who live in different places around the world. And we've heard a lot about the plight of honeybees around the world, and there's a lot of concern about honeybees for good reason. But the same things that are harming our honeybees are also harming our indigenous wild bees. And there's really kind of, scientists have identified these four interconnected threats that are facing our bees. Habitat destruction is one big thing, just the destruction of forests and other kinds of habitats that bees live in. Um, Pesticide use, especially in agriculture, has become a really massive contributor to the decline in bee and bird populations, among other animals. Climate change is affecting um, the habitats for bees and is making it harder for bees to survive. And there's these mites that are becoming more and more of a problem for both honeybees and native bees, small mites that are parasitic to bees that affect their ability to thrive and kill them in many cases. And these are interconnected threats because they're all kind of related, and one thing is making the other thing worse. So climate change is meaning that mites are having a better time surviving through winters. They're not as cold winters, that not killing as many mites, for example. And I think it's important to sort of talk quickly about these four interconnected threats and acknowledge um, that bees do really need our help right now. And there are many different ways that we can do it. And creating habitat in our garden is a small thing, but there are other things too that are larger issues: social, political, economic, cultural issues that are affecting our bees that are, I think, important to acknowledge in this conversation. From that, I want to move on to talking about some of these amazing bees that do live around us. So these pictures are from Habitat Acquisition Trust. They have a lovely little 4-page primer on caring for pollinators, and I love these pictures, so I stole it from them. And the there's these different groups of bees that live in our home here on Vancouver Island. The first are these plasterer bees. So they're a solitary insect, and they actually secrete this kind of natural plastic that they use to line their nests. So they make nests in small holes. Bumblebees, like I said, there are many different species of bumblebees, and they tend to live in the ground, and they will find burrows of mice commonly, or other small rodents that have excavated holes in the ground, and they go down into the ground and build a little nest down in the ground. And sometimes, if you're lucky, you can see a queen bumblebee, really big, almost looks like a small bird, who's doing this funny flight pattern, kind of flying back and forth, looking for a little hole in the ground to build a new kind of family of bees around. And mason bees are another group of bees who are super efficient pollinators, and they live in little holes in dead wood commonly, and they're known as mason bees because this group of bees uses mud to build little cell walls. They lay an egg, they pack a bunch of pollen next to the egg, and then they build a little wall in the hole, and then they'll lay another egg, pack some more pollen, build another wall, and their larvae live inside of these little mud cells that they build inside of holes, develop into their pupae in there, and then emerge from that hole, usually in the springtime, um, when temperatures warm up, to complete their adult life cycle. There are other kinds of bees too that live around us. Metallic green sweat bees are one of the most beautiful types of bees. I see them around from time to time, and I'm always really excited to see them. They have this amazing glossy, shiny back. And then the mining bees I see often when I'm out on hikes. Sometimes, if you look closely, you'll see little tiny holes in the ground, and notice, if you look closely, that there's all these bees that are flying in and out of these holes. And there's many different kinds of mining bees that dig holes in the ground and build spaces for their young to grow and thrive underground. So all of these different bees live in our surroundings, and it's good to watch for them and to start to try to identify them. And I'm very much a beginner still on my bee identification. I certainly know the blue orchard mason bee, and I just kind of get a lot of excitement out of seeing different types of bees right now and trying to identify them. It's hard to find good resources because there's 450 species of bees in BC, and it is difficult to get good at identifying all the different species. But at least being amazed that there are so many and starting to know a bit about them is what this workshop is about. If you're interested in diving deeper, I will share after the workshop via email a link to Pollinator Partnership Canada. Has this 10-part series of webinars that go deep into caring for pollinators. And some of the webinars, I think, are focused on identification if you do want to learn more about identifying the pollinators in your yard. So from bees, we'll talk a bit about some of the birds that we have around here. Birds, there are lots of different types of birds, and the habitats define kind of where they hang out. Obviously, shore birds live along the shore of the ocean. So if you're lucky enough to have an ocean close residence, you may be lucky to be graced by some shore birds. Some birds really prefer deep forests. Some like forest edges. I'm going to talk about some of the birds that I see in my very urban Victoria property here, close to the Royal Jubilee Hospital. There's a couple introduced bullies in our heavily sort of disturbed urban areas, especially, and they're pictured here. So in the top right is the top sort of left, it's the European starling. Starlings are very vocal. They're quite pretty birds, as you can see in the picture, and they fly around in big flocks, and they can sort of displace other birds, and they're just there's a lot of them. They really take well to living with people. I kind of marvel at them. I think I actually don't know how much of a threat they are to our indigenous birds. The other bird here is the house sparrow. The house sparrow is a threat to our other birds and eats the eggs and babies of our wild birds. He's a real bully. They're not around very much in the wintertime, but this time of year I see them all the time, and they sort of become dominant around my neighborhood through the summer, and they kind of scare away a lot of the other birds. So I'm not a big fan of the house sparrow. But there are lots of interesting birds, and there was a picture before of the red-breasted nuthatch, which is another one of my favorite birds. Northern flicker is not a common sight in the city, but one you see from time to time, a kind of woodpecker that likes to eat things out of you see them hunting often kind of on the ground, not so much in rotten wood, but pecking down into the ground. Dark-eyed junco is a seed eater. That's one of the more common birds at my feeder through the winter time, along with the black-capped chickadee. They're the two most common birds at my bird feeder through the winter. They're both lovely little birds. My favorite visitor in my yard is the Bewick's wren. They're super inquisitive little birds. They like to they get quite close. I found a couple in my shed actually when I was doing some work in my yard, and they were hunting spiders in my yard, and they flew out of my shed after startling me and sat right on the roof of my shed and chatted to me for quite a while. So they're very interesting little inquisitive birds. The barred owls are the most common owl around Victoria. They're sometimes spotted downtown. They will hunt all the mice and rats that live downtown. And with the seed library, we had for 1 year, there was a barred owl that liked to hang out in front of the central branch on the big artwork that's in front of the central library in downtown Victoria. Barred owls have a bad reputation because they're sort of replacing a spotted owl in their habitat, and they're very similar to the spotted owl, but much more adaptable to a variety of different climates. The spotted owl is famous for being sort of emblematic of old growth rain, like coastal temperate rainforest. And the barred owl is in Victoria always a lovely thing to see for me. And the downy woodpecker is another of my favorite urban birds, which I see around from time to time, not as commonly as the dark-eyed junco or black-capped chickadee, but they're around. And these are just a few of the birds. If you're interested in getting to know more birds, one great resource that we have are the natural history societies and these folks, birders, who go out and talk to each other about birds. I like going to Swan Lake around here and listening over the shoulder of the birders down there. There's people who know a ton about birds, much more than I do. I'm just a very kind of early stage beginner, somebody who's got more of a gardening interest, but I just love birds and I'm trying to learn more about them. Um, there's a lot of good books, of course, and much information, and I'll share a good resource shortly as well if you're interested in housing birds or feeding birds. In addition to bees and birds, there are many other different kinds of animals. So we talked a bit about butterflies before. There's a little graphic with all these different kinds of butterflies. Reptiles too. Snakes can be really important in the garden, and they really do well if you have like rock piles or rock walls. Snakes will make homes in those, and if you have snakes around, I would count yourself fortunate. There's 4 different kinds of snakes that live on Vancouver Island. 3 are garter snakes, and 1 is the sharp-tailed snake. Here around Victoria, the sharp-tailed snake is a critically endangered snake that's dependent upon Garry Oak ecosystems. It's a really interesting snake that does live around us here, and if you are lucky enough to have one in your yard, please try to take care of it. And all of these snakes are important to take care of. We also have 2 different kinds of lizards that live on the island. There's the northern alligator lizard and then the European wall lizard. The introduced European wall lizard has been going crazy in numbers in the last couple of years, and I don't know how that's affecting the northern alligator lizard. I'm sorry, I should learn more before hosting a workshop like this, but time is always an issue. You can see in the picture the European wall lizard at bottom right is a little bit more ornately kind of patterned. The northern alligator lizard, not quite so much. And then there's 2 types of turtles, the western painted turtle and the introduced slider turtle, some of our local reptiles. We also have a really interesting diversity of bats, and bats are really important animals in our ecosystems and have a very bad reputation. The Habitat Acquisition Trust has been doing a lot of great work in trying to support bat habitat and building bat boxes. You can build roosting boxes for bats, and if you're interested in that, there's lots of resources available online. Here are 10 different species of bats who live in our local area. One thing about bats that's important to know is that they actually like to drink kind of on the wing. They'll fly down, and so they require kind of big open areas of water. So if you have a big pond in your yard, you may be helping bats a lot. And with urbanization around my house, there's not a lot of places a bat can go to get a drink. And that's really affected the distribution of bat populations, especially in urban areas. There are many different threats facing bats these days, and they are, even though they have such a bad reputation in our culture, really amazing, sometimes quite beautiful, and very important creatures in our ecosystem. And of course, there's many other animals besides. So many different species of wasps and hornets, and many of them are non-aggressive and important to ecosystem health. I'm somebody who's actually deathly allergic to all stinging insects, and yet I still love them, and try to make space for them as much as I can. There's so many different kinds of parasitic wasps, which are tiny little wasps who often are also pollinators. Some wasps will participate in pollination, and they're all predators that eat the insects that eat our plants. So if you're a gardener, I think you have to have some respect for the wasps and hornets. Beetles and moths too. There are so many different species. I don't know very much about them, but I always do like to marvel at them. There's not that much information available about all of these fascinating animals in our garden. It doesn't mean they're not important, but it does mean, that there's not that much known about what was here before all of this sort of urbanization and colonization, and it can be difficult for scientists to know, because the smaller animals were not as popular in science and are just now really people starting to turn their attention to these smaller animals and learning more about them. Um, so the final section I'm going to talk about is nesting structures. I'm just going to pause here and see if anybody has any questions. So one question, would you please talk about how we can make our ground attractive to the kind of bees that live in the ground? So from my experience, bees like undisturbed ground to live in. And, I haven't heard very much else than that on ways that you can really help make your ground attractive to. I've never seen anybody have a lot of success in providing space for ground nesting insects to make nests. I think the thing that's always recommended here is that if you have ground nesting insects, you leave them alone. So you don't go digging around where they are. And it may require, and the reason I like to talk about them is because a lot of people don't even know they're there. And I actually noticed that there was a ground nesting insect, that like a bee, that was making a nest right in the middle of my lawn last year. And so I kind of made a little like zone around it and told my kids, like, let's try to leave this bee alone. And so just noticing where they are and trying to provide space for them, I think is kind of the commonly recommended thing. Thank you for that good question. Another comment, thank you for mentioning these bully invasive birds. A friend wrote an article about providing nest boxes for native birds that keep them safe from the invasive ones, and has posted a link in the chat. That sounds awesome. Yeah, the northern flicker will bang on my vent pipe on my house during mating season to try and get a mate. Yes, they do that. It can be annoying for folks. It's fun to think that they're around though, and try to find beauty in the sound, I guess. It's neat to see them in our neighborhoods. They're a beautiful bird. Yeah, thank you everybody for these great comments and questions. I'm going to go back to sharing my screen, and we'll talk a little bit about nesting structures for birds and for bees. I don't have a lot of information to share here, but I will share a bit about making space for bees. So commonly with our indigenous bees, other than honeybees, which obviously people keep quite commonly, a lot of folks are getting excited about making houses for blue orchard mason bees. And they live in these little holes, and they like ideally a hole that's 5/16 of an inch wide. And so you can purchase all these different kinds of nesting structures for mason bees, and you can also purchase mason bee cocoons, and you put the cocoons with the nesting structure in the springtime, right around now, when the daytime temperatures are consistently above 12 degrees Celsius. It's been a strange year this year with last week here in Victoria, we were having consistent frosts in early April, and it was probably a bit too cold for the bees. Even though the daytime highs were getting warm enough for the bees to emerge, I was quite worried, and I'm still quite worried about what's going to happen to all of the blue orchard mason bee communities that I steward. I've put most of my bees out now, and I'm hoping they're going to be okay. But I've certainly seen, with the warmer weather we've had in the last couple of days, a lot of bees emerging and flying around. So you put your cocoons in this picture of the nesting box on the top, you can see there's a couple of little slats, and there's a space to put your cocoons in the top there, and the cocoons emerge and the bees fly out through those holes, and then the mothers come and fly into those little holes. And like I was saying before, they gather pollen, they pack the pollen in, they lay a little egg, and then they'll build a little mud wall. And in a hole of, about 6 or 8 inches deep, they can lay up to sort of 12 cocoons, or 12 eggs, and those eggs hatch, and as larvae, like little tiny caterpillar, they eat all of the pollen that their mother has left for them, and then they go into their little cocoon, their chrysalis, and they stay in there all winter, in nature, and then in the spring they emerge again. But with all of the mite predation that's affecting bees around North America, the blue orchard mason bees are having a very difficult time surviving. And if you put bees out and just let them kind of live naturally, a lot of them will peter out and die. There'll be no more bees left because the mites will kill them all. So more and more people are starting to take their cocoons out in the fall, and it's important not to disturb them until October. Before that, they're still forming inside of their cocoon, but once we get to around October, the cocoons are fully formed, and you can safely take them out of their nesting boxes. So if you are providing housing, it's nice to get housing that is easy to open. So there's 3 different methods for making something easy to open. One is having these wooden or plastic, you can buy trays that fit together and that open like this, and that expose all of the holes inside. So in the middle of the top picture, that's what you have, these stacked wooden trays with holes that you can see the kind of line where you can pop open, and then in the fall you can gently nuzzle the cocoons out of the holes. Then beside that, there's bamboo, and bamboo is actually really nice because it's very easy to split. You can just get like a little knife and tap it on the top, and the bamboo just splits open really quite easily. And then you can get all of the cocoons out of the bamboo. And then these paper rolls at the bottom also work really nicely because you can just unroll the paper, and get at the cocoons quite easily without hurting them. If you just drill holes in a piece of wood, you can't get the cocoons out of there. And so what happens is you get a lot of mites that start to damage the bees. So when you get the cocoons out in October, what's done is there's 2 methods for cleaning the cocoons, and it's quite amazing to see all of the mites and things that are in there with the cocoons, and they need to be kind of cleaned off. And the first thing we do usually is a little bit of water and just gently rolling on your fingers and pulling off all of the stuff that's on the cocoons. And then it's recommended that you use a diluted oxygen bleach solution, like a really well diluted 1 to 20 or 1 to 50 parts, depending on who you ask. Soak the clean cocoons in bleach to make sure that you're killing all of the mites. Some people don't want to use the bleach, and I definitely understand that. I have used it in the past and have had good results. It's up to you. The bees are in a waterproof sealed cocoon, and it doesn't seem to bother them, but I always wonder, and I think sometimes I don't. And I find if I don't use the bleach, they definitely do seem to have slightly more mites the next year, but they do survive too without the bleach. And then once you've cleaned the cocoons, they get stored. Either a lot of people will keep them in their refrigerator, and you just want to keep them. The problem with modern refrigerators is that it can be quite dry. So if you do put them in the refrigerator, it's not recommended that you put them in one of the crispers where it's a bit more humid. But the best case scenario actually is just to leave them outside in a cool shed or somewhere that's outdoors where it's just the natural temperature. And then some people I know, if they have the bees out, like this year where it was so cold in the evenings, we had all these frosts. Some of the people who had their bees out in their shed, they actually brought their bees into the fridge for a couple of weeks until they were sure that the temperatures were consistently above 12°C and we weren't getting cold frosts through the night. And then they put their bees out. It's a bit of a sort of a labor of love. There's actually, I make it sound like a lot of work. It's not really. There's this moment in October where you've got to open them up and clean all the bees out, which takes not that much time. Then you put them away, and then you just got to put them out in the spring, and then they kind of take care of themselves otherwise. So that's a bit about caring for the blue orchard mason bee. And you can also put up, other bees will use holes that are 5/16 of an inch too. And then there are slightly smaller holes that other bees will use. Life Cycles has this really cool orchard called the Welland Community Orchard that has a really interesting diversity of bees that live there. And so they have a bunch of leaf cutter bees that use a slightly smaller hole, and then an even smaller hole, which is used by actually a kind of wasp that will go and grab aphids and put the aphids in these tiny little holes and build little sort of like kind of like plasticky kind of barriers for their little babies. So their babies emerge and eat the aphids that their mother has left for them. So nowadays you will find in some stores, like I know Borden Mercantile carries a diversity of different kinds of nesting structures, and some of them now are not just for blue orchard mason bees, but you can find some that are smaller holes, especially in those like farm and feed type stores like Borden Mercantile or Integrity Sales are the two that come instantly to mind for me in our region that are starting to branch out and provide nesting structures for more than just the blue orchard mason bee. But the mason bee is certainly, the blue orchard mason bee is still the one that most people are caring for. It's a great joy for me to do it every year and see the bees coming out. It's fun to do with my two little kids. So that was a bit about building nesting structures for mason bees. And then you can also build nesting boxes for birds. And I really recommend the Cornell Lab of Ornithology for information about birds, both for feeding birds as well as for providing bird boxes. They have an amazing amount of resources and all kinds of great projects you can get involved in as a citizen scientist monitoring birds in your region. Their information is fantastic. And so this is an example of a nesting box design that they've provided for black-capped chickadees, as well as a number of other birds that live in our region. And the one thing that I really wanted to highlight for folks who are interested in providing houses for birds, especially if you're living in an area where house sparrows are common, which is pretty much any urban area in North America or the world, I'm not sure. It's important that you do not make a hole that is larger than 1.25 inch, because or that it is 1.25 inch or larger, I guess, that these holes will admit the house sparrows, and so they'll come and just eat the babies of the birds you're trying to make houses for. And so the Cornell Lab of Ornithology really strongly recommends that if you're going to build a nesting box for larger birds, that you do so in a heavily wooded area where house sparrows are not common. The other thing to do is if you're going to try to build a nesting box for yourself, I would just say check out the Cornell Lab of Ornithology's resources. They have these designs which are really helpful, but then they also have a web page that has some kind of like helpful tips on how to build a good bird box. I built 3 this year, and I haven't had any birds start living in them yet, but I'm watching keenly and hoping somebody's going to take up residence soon. They're really fun to build. And then, of course, you can just buy your own bird boxes. One thing that they recommend strongly is you make sure there's no perch. Some bird boxes have a little perch on the hole. That just allows predators to sit there and kill the birds you're trying to house. So no perches on any of the boxes. There's a few other helpful hints, like you want to make sure that the inside of the box is roughed up so that the baby hatchlings can climb up the side of the wood and get to the hole. I guess sometimes it's too smooth in there and the bird gets stuck and can never get out, which is obviously a tragic ending to an early life. Making sure the birds are really nice and dry in there is really important. And then they have good recommendations on which direction to face the bird boxes. Different species, I guess, have slightly different preferences, and a lot of the information they provide is related to the prevailing winds and which direction to face the nesting box in relation to the prevailing winds. So I figure here in Victoria, with such an ocean influence, our prevailing wind is from the west, sort of west-southwest. but it may be different for different areas. If you live behind a big mountain or something, the prevailing wind may come in a slightly different direction. So that's about all I wanted to share about housing birds. And that's my last slide. So just check the time. It's 8:13. We said this would be it would be no longer than an hour and a half. So I've fulfilled that. I want to thank you all very much for coming. I hope that you got something out of this. Like I said, I will share all of the slides that I put together, and I'll pause here at the end for any more questions if you want to stick around and ask questions or listen to questions being asked. I won't go until all questions are answered, or at least attempted to be answered. The Greater Victoria Public Library is such a kind steward and supporter of our work at Life Cycles, and such an important partner of the Victoria Seed Library in making these events possible. So I want to really thank the Greater Victoria Public Library for all that they do, and then Life Cycles too, and their amazing staff. If you're interested in learning more about the Victoria Seed Library, there's 2 links here where you can find out more. And like I said, if you want to become a member and get access to our interesting collection of seeds, we have a member orientation in 2 weeks' time. Everybody is welcome to attend. The membership is free and just requires attendance at one of these member orientation sessions, and then you're a lifetime member and you can access our seeds every year for the rest of your life. Hopefully the seed library lives as long as you do. Yeah, that's it. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and see if anybody has any questions. So there's somebody had house sparrows in one of their nesting boxes. I'm just reading, and comment that once the house sparrows have claimed a nest box, they won't give up easily, even if you've protected the entrance so that they can no longer get in. You might want to move it to another location. That's really lovely. They're getting connected if you want more information. Somebody gets different looking cocoons in with my mason bees. Should I leave them? I don't know what they are. That's interesting. I'm not sure what they are either. Sometimes what happens with the mason bees is they'll get a little hole in them and they get predatory wasps go inside, and the wasp can lay up to 60 babies inside one of the cocoons. But it sounds like maybe that's not what's happening there. I'm not quite sure what you should do with that. I think I would probably just clean them and put them out with the mason bees. And then watch and see if you could learn, and see if you could maybe put the different looking cocoons in a different little release box, and then you can look and see if they chewed out of their cocoon and if they happily emerged, and try to learn and figure out who they are just by watching. I think that's what I would do. Question, is it necessary or recommended to clean out a bird box each season, or is it best to leave it alone? They recommend cleaning it out each season. I guess if you don't clean it out, it can become quite highly populated with different kinds of parasitic mites and things that are not good for the birds. So cleaning it out is what they recommend.
Hi, I have a question.
Sure, go for it.
I used to have like, I don't know, like 4 or 5 birds that I bought from a store, but unfortunately that they didn't, they didn't last really long. What I mean is like 2 of them like died after 1 week, and the 4 or 5 other one, they flew away. So I don't know how to prevent that one. I know there's like some particular ways or something, but
I'm
I
so
just
sorry.
don't know.
I missed what it was that you got for. Was it birds?
Yeah, I don't know if this related, but I just want to ask for tips that can just keep them like,
For keeping birds as pets?
yeah, and keeping them healthy so they don't die too fast like that.
Yeah, no, that sounds rough. I'm sorry, I'm not the person to ask. I really don't know anything about keeping birds as pets. Um, I would, yeah, try like the pet shop might be a good place to ask. Um,
Oh, okay.
yeah, I'm sorry.
That's okay. Yeah, thank you.
I was I was reading that the previously somebody was asking about different kinds of cocoons, and somebody said sounds like cuckoo bees are invading the nest. I've never heard of that. It shows you that I'm definitely still learning too.
Yeah, there are some bees and even wasps that they'll invade a nest and lay their eggs among the other eggs, and over time, that hatch actually can take over the hive.
Right.
And but it is a type of bee that it generally does that. It doesn't build its own nests.
Right.
It generally, goes in and invades another one.
Yeah. Interesting.
And we have the Scobie ducks.
Cool. Thank you for that.
A couple horses. And
I really appreciate having other people here who can help answer questions. It's always really nice. And, I offer these things as somebody who's still learning and thinking, well, I can offer information to beginners because I know what I know, but there's still so much more that I don't. And it's really nice to be able to have sort of like community sourced knowledge sharing. It's really great. Well, I don't see any other questions here. If you do have any questions, feel free to speak up or type them in the chat. I'm just reviewing to make sure I got them. That looks like it. So take care, everybody. I'm gonna end our meeting now. Best of luck and enjoy the lovely weather. Hopefully, I get a chance to meet you one day.